Okay, so we are starting the writing process for formal academic essays. My screen's going to look a little bit different than yours because I'm using my laptop, but it's going to have the same content. So, quick review of the acronym PACOW. When we talked about that when we were writing writing emails, the P was for purpose, which stood for why I was writing. So if I'm thinking of a formal academic essay, the majority of the time I'm writing one of those. Usually I'm not doing that for like funsies, but I'm doing that because I've been given a task by a teacher, and that's usually in the form of a prompt. So a prompt, by definition, is when I have a series, like it's usually 2 to 3 sentences long, and it has directions and usually some sort of question involved, okay? So, in addition to the purpose, we also talked about the A, or the audience, which, if I am defining that, the audience is the person I'm either writing directly to, if I'm writing something like an email, or the person who's going to be reading whatever I write. In this instance, because we're talking about a formal academic essay, 99.5% of the time this is going to be my teacher. Okay. So the reason that's important is because the person reading it, I need to make sure that I'm using the correct or the best tone for that person. So I'm going to make sure that that tone is formal. Okay, now when you guys are writing these notes down, make sure that you are kind of processing them and putting them in your own words. You don't want to necessarily just be writing down word for word. That's why I'm spending time talking about everything and not just kind of typing everything and making you read it as I type. So there are, when we get a prompt for a formal academic essay, we have to do something that's called explicating the prompt. So if you double tap the word explicating on your iPad, that will bring up a context menu. It's not going to look like the one I have because the one I have is obviously I'm using the web version, but yours should bring up something that allows you to change the fonts or underline, or it'll also offer the option of define or smart lookup. So you can take a minute and do that. Tap define or smart lookup and read through what the explanation is for what explication is. And then after you've read that, you are going to write down like an explanation of what it means. Now, for me, when I talk about an explication, what I'm talking about is you're taking apart something. You're breaking it down into smaller pieces so that you can understand what the big picture is of something. So those of you who had Mr. Kirby last year, or read, if you were in another school and not with us, you were with somebody else, 9 times out of 10, ninth graders read Romeo and Juliet. So I'm assuming that the teacher, when they had you read that, although I know things were very different with COVID, I'm assuming that the teacher had you break down the longer chunks of speech into smaller parts to make it easier to understand. And that's basically what explicating is. It's when you're breaking something down in order to understand the whole of it. Okay, so anytime I talk about explicating a prompt, that means that's what I mean. I'm breaking it down into smaller portions that are more easily digestible. Now, there are two ways to do that. There are two things to look for when I'm explicating a prompt, and that is identifying what the implicit questions are versus the explicit. Now, implicit, I'm going to double tap that, and I'm actually going to highlight that. You should have a similar highlight function on the iPad, so you're going to learn how to take a minute and do that. Double tap the word implicit, and then find that highlight function at the top, and you want to change it to yellow. That's going to come in handy when we do the practice. So the implicit question is basically the hidden questions. So this is something I'm probably going to have to identify or name or explain before I'm able to actually answer the big or explicit question. Okay, so the hidden questions. Okay, an explicit question, again, highlight that in green this time, is the obvious one. This is the one that kind of hits you over the head. This is the one that you can actually see. It's the how, the why, the when, the where, the why. I repeated why. So, usually a how or a why. Okay. Also, implicit questions, I'm going to go back here. There's usually two or more in the prompt. So the two or more of those questions in the prompt that I'll need to break down. And then the explicit is usually a how or a why, and there's usually only one of those. Okay? So we have here a sample prompt. Like you guys are given in your math classes, when a math teacher talks to you about a new process, they'll put a example problem on the board. I'm going to do the exact same thing here, except it's going to be a sample prompt. And then you are going to pick one of the prompts on the next page to do for yourself. So this sample prompt, I'm looking at technology has become an ingrained part of life that is absolutely necessary that all students learn various ways to use it. In a well-developed essay, explain whether or not this statement is accurate. So if I were explicating this prompt, I would have to identify all of the the implicit questions first. So for me, I'm looking at the first sentence. Technology has become such an ingrained part of life that it is absolutely necessary that all students learn various ways to use it. For me, I'm going to highlight this because I think that is an implicit question. So I would have to be able to explain or define what technology is or includes. Because if I'm not able to articulate that or explain that, I'm not going to be able to answer the explicit question, which is that one. That's going to be my big one. Do I agree with that statement or not is the explicit question. The implicit question that I have to answer first is defining what technology is or includes. However, there's more than one implicit question. So in order to answer whether or not I agree with the statement, I have to make sure I understand the whole statement here. So technology has become such an ingrained part of life. Probably going to want to figure out be able to explain what parts of life. Okay, so what parts of life is technology used? Would be the next thing I need to break down. That's worded awkwardly, but that's okay, because this is all to help get my thoughts organized. So after I explain what technology is, or I figure out what technology means or includes, the next thing I would be thinking about is what does parts of life mean? Does that mean like to actually breathe, or am I going to have to break it down into like, oh, this is work versus personal life versus family, that kind of stuff. And then the last, because there's a third implicit question here is going to be the various ways. What does that mean? What is a way? What if I'm talking about technology and various ways it's used, I would want to be able to articulate what that means as well. Okay, so I have 3 implicit questions, and I have 1 explicit question. Like I said, there's usually multiple of the implicit and 1 of the explicit. Okay. Okay, so that's it. That's the explication process in a nutshell. I'm not going to answer those questions yet. That's going to be the next step in our process. I'm just explicating to understand where to start. So what you're going to do now is you're going to take that whole process, exactly how I did it. I'm going to highlight all the yellow, the implicit questions in yellow, and then list what those specifically look like or phrased like so I can answer them. And then the explicit question I'll highlight in green. And you're going to do that for 2 of these prompts. You're not going to write 2 essays. You are going to, so I'm changing that right there. We're going to practice the explication, consider it like 2 math problems. So there are 4 prompts that you can choose from. You're going to pick the 2 that interest you, and then you're going to go through this whole process again. I'm going to highlight in yellow, and then I'm going to list the implicit questions, then highlight in green, and list the explicit questions. Okay? So the ones that you don't answer, you can delete those so they're not even on the page, but you're going to want to do this process for 2 of those prompts.